She walked into a Comanche victory dance pretending to be a guest. The chief was still wearing her husband's scalp on his belt. 20 minutes later, he was dead, and she walked out with his boots. No soldier gave her orders. No general wrote her a medal. She did it alone, on foot, in enemy territory, at night. That is not a movie scene. That is a documented event. And it is only one of the 15 women you are about to meet. For 200 years, Hollywood has built an entire industry out of the American frontier. Gunfighters, generals, outlaws, cavalry charges, dozens of films, hundreds of hours of screen time. And in almost none of it do you see the women who actually shaped how those wars were fought and how they ended. Not as background characters, as war chiefs, as spies, as the ones who turned the tide of a battle or ended one with a single conversation. Some of them killed, some of them saved lives. All of them did something the record books tried very hard to forget. What makes these 15 stories different from the myths you already know is that none of them require exaggeration. Every single one is backed by something, a tribal oral tradition preserved across generations, a U.S. Army report that couldn't avoid mentioning them, a court transcript, a surviving photograph, or a personal account written by someone who was actually in the room. This is the real story, the one no studio ever optioned. Stay until the end, because the final name on this list is the one Apache leadership itself called irreplaceable. And once you hear what she did, you'll understand exactly why one line of Apache oral history still calls her a shield. Number 15, Massachusetts, 1605. A war is about to begin that will kill a larger share of the population than any conflict in American history, including the Civil War. On one side, the English colonies, on the other, a coalition of Algonquian nations. And commanding 300 warriors of the Pocasset people is a woman the English themselves refer to, in their own letters, as a queen. Weetamoo did not inherit a ceremonial title. She ran a war. She decided which villages to defend, which alliances to make, and when to strike. An English captive named Mary Rowlandson, held in Weetamoo's own household for 11 weeks, later wrote an account describing a woman who dressed and carried herself with more authority than most English nobility she had ever seen. For over a year, Weetamoo's forces held off colonial militias that outnumbered them. Then, in August 1676, surrounded near a riverbank with her forces scattered, she tried to cross to safety and drowned in the current. The colonists found her body, cut off her head, and displayed it on a pole in the town of Taunton, a punishment normally reserved for the most feared enemy commanders, not a footnote in someone else's war. They did not do that to a bystander. They did that to the woman who had kept an empire's army from sleeping easy for a year. King Philip's War, the conflict she helped lead, remains proportionally the deadliest war ever fought on American soil. And the woman the English feared enough to behead has almost no presence in how that war gets taught today. She is a healer, a spiritual leader trusted by 6 villages, and she has just tried to burn down a mission. When Mission San Gabriel expanded onto Tongva land and outlawed native ceremonies, Toypurina did something almost no one else in the region attempted. She organized a coordinated uprising across 6 villages to strike the mission in a single night. The plan was betrayed before it launched. Spanish soldiers were waiting. At her trial, she was expected to apologize. She did not. The court record, an actual colonial document that survives today, quotes her telling the priests directly that she despised them for living on her people's land. For that, she was not executed. She was exiled forever from the region where she was born, sent hundreds of kilometers away, and never allowed to return home. 2 centuries later, a university and a mural bear her name. But most Americans have never heard it once. She never held a rifle in that uprising, and it did not matter. The Spanish crown treated a healer's words as dangerous enough to warrant permanent banishment from her own birthplace. June 1878, the height of the Bannock War. A Paiute woman named Sarah Winnemucca rides through hostile territory between Idaho and Oregon for 3 straight days, covering roughly 360 kilometers on horseback, to reach the camp where her own father, Chief Winnemucca, is being held. She slips into the camp under cover of darkness, helps dozens of people escape, and still makes it back with intelligence for General Oliver Howard. It is written into the Army's own records. She served as a scout and interpreter the U.S. military itself relied on. But her most dangerous fight came after the war, with a pen instead of a horse. In 1883, she published Life Among the Paiutes, the first autobiography ever written by a Native American woman in the United States. She then spent years touring the country, delivering hundreds of lectures against the reservation system, and was received by government officials in Washington who had no idea what to do with a woman the Army trusted in the field, and the Capitol could not silence on paper. By the time she died in 1891, she had done something almost no Indigenous woman of her era was permitted to do twice. She had been trusted inside a war room, and she had been read inside a Congress that usually refused to listen at all. 1755, the Battle of Talowa. An 18-year-old Cherokee woman is chewing lead into deadlier musket balls for her husband on the front line. When he is shot dead beside her, everyone expects her to fall back. Instead, Nanyehi picks up his rifle, rallies the Cherokee line, and helps turn a losing battle into a victory. For that, she is given the title Gigao, beloved woman, one of the highest honors in Cherokee society, with a seat on the National Council and authority over the fate of prisoners of war. What almost never makes it into the story is what she did for the next 4 decades. She became one of the most effective diplomats her nation ever produced, negotiating directly with American commissioners, trying to prevent the wars she knew her people could not win. She even introduced dairy cattle to Cherokee farming to build economic independence outside of war altogether. A second, quieter kind of battle most accounts never mention. A warrior at 18, a stateswoman for the rest of her life, Hollywood loves the battle. It is never once told the second half. Around 1840, a war council of 300 Crow chiefs ranks its most influential leaders. Third on that list is a woman, and she was not even born Crow. She was captured from the Gros Ventre at around age 10, adopted by a Crow warrior who had lost his own sons, and trained on the bow, the rifle, and the horse exactly as a son would have been. When Blackfeet raiders attacked her camp, she rode out alone and came back having killed several of them without a scratch on her body. From there, she led her own war parties, captured hundreds of horses in single raids, and eventually married 4 wives, exactly as any male chief of standing would. A fur trader who knew her personally, Edwin Denig, wrote that she was a chief in every real sense of the word, respected in council and feared in battle. In 1854, she rode out to negotiate peace with the very nation she had been born into. They recognized her and killed her in an ambush. She died trying to end a war after a lifetime spent winning them. Think about that timeline for a second. A captured child, adopted into a nation not her own, rises to become its 3rd most powerful chief through nothing but skill and results. And modern textbooks still routinely skip her name entirely. There is a waterfall in Glacier National Park that thousands of tourists photograph every summer with no idea who it is named for. Pitamakan of the Blackfeet Piikani people lost her husband in a Crow raid. Instead of mourning at home as tradition expected, she did something reserved only for men. She formed her own war party. Piikani oral history records multiple expeditions she led, capturing enemy horses and defending hunting grounds that fed her entire community. Her tribal council granted her a formal honor name, normally given only to men, Running Eagle. She kept leading warriors until the very end, dying in battle against the Flathead around 1878, weapon still in hand. Running Eagle Falls carries her name today. Almost nobody who stops for the photo knows they are standing in front of a monument to a war leader. The waterfall gets thousands of visitors a year. The story behind its name gets almost none. An Apache woman loses her husband to a Comanche raiding party, and the warriors of her own band refuse to go after the men responsible. So she goes alone. Her name, Guyen, means she who looks ahead, and she earns it by tracking the Comanche camp for days on foot, alone, through country most men would not cross without a party. She waits for the night of their victory celebration. The chief is dancing, her husband's scalp hanging from his belt. Guyen approaches as if she is simply another guest at the fire, gains his trust, and kills him in the middle of the celebration. She walks out of the camp carrying his boots and his scalp as proof for her people. That story is still told today among the Mescalero and Chiricahua Apache. Years later, Guyen survived the Tres Castillos massacre, one of the deadliest single strikes against the Apache, and eventually died a prisoner at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. No man in her band did what she did that night. She did it alone. While the men on both sides were aiming rifles at each other, the person both the U.S. Army and Geronimo's band trusted enough to carry messages between them was an Apache woman. Teteste rode with Geronimo as both scout and fighter, and she spoke fluent English, an unusual and valuable skill at the time. That is exactly why, when the final surrender came in 1886, both sides needed her in the room. She helped carry the terms that ended one of the last major indigenous wars in North America. Her reward from the government she had just helped negotiate a peace with was 8 years in prison, first in Florida, then Alabama, where she contracted both tuberculosis and pneumonia, diseases that killed dozens of the Apache prisoners held alongside her. She survived both illnesses and lived until 1955, long enough to watch Hollywood tell Geronimo's story again and again on screen, without once mentioning the woman who helped bring his war to an end, the same woman both armies needed in the room to make that ending possible at all. We're at the halfway point, and here's what should already be bothering you. Every single name so far comes with a paper trail, a court record, an army dispatch, a published autobiography, a photograph with a living descendant confirming it. This isn't folklore dressed up as history. This is history that was sitting in plain sight the entire time, in archives anyone could have opened. The next 7 names are, if anything, even harder to ignore because 2 of them involve the single most famous battle in the entire history of the American West. Keep watching. June 1876, Little Bighorn. Custer leads the 7th Cavalry into a trap. And among the warriors waiting for him is a woman of Arapaho and Cheyenne descent named Pretty Nose. 2 years later, a photographer captures her portrait at Fort Keogh. That photograph still exists and circulates online today. Most people who see it have no idea who they are looking at. Among her people, Pretty Nose held the rank of war chief, not a symbolic title, an operational one. Here's the part that is hard to believe. She lived to the age of 101, passing away in 1952. She spent her final years on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, meaning the woman who once faced cavalry charges on horseback lived to see 2 world wars in airplanes crossing the same skies, where she had once fought with a bow. Hollywood has never touched her story. The photograph is the only proof most people will ever see. A woman who held a war chief's rank staring directly into a camera lens, and almost nobody stops long enough to ask why. June 1876, the Battle of the Rosebud. Hundreds of armed men are fighting across open ground, and in the middle of it, a Crow woman walks into the battle carrying nothing but a wooden club. No rifle, no bow. She has one thing driving her forward. The Lakota had killed her brother. Witnesses said she charged forward shouting that her voice was her ammunition. When a wounded Crow warrior fell from his horse and was about to be overrun, she rode directly into the gunfire, closed the distance on a mounted Lakota fighter, and struck him with her club. Coup, the single most prestigious act of courage recognized among the Plains nations, worth more honor than a kill from a distance. He was killed moments later, and she took his scalp. That night, during the victory dance, she cut the scalp into pieces and distributed them among the other warriors so more people could share in the honor of the day. Of the small number of scalps the Crow took at the Rosebud, one belonged to a woman who rode into a cavalry-scale battle armed with a stick and chose, at the height of her own honor, to share the credit instead of keeping it. Same battlefield, same morning. Tashinamani, known as Moving Robe Woman, is gathering wild turnips near the Little Bighorn River when the gunfire starts. Minutes later, she learns her younger brother, Deeds, has just been killed by Custer's soldiers. She does not run for cover. She ties back her braids, mounts her horse, and rides straight for the front line, calling for the warriors around her to follow. Fighters who were present, including the respected warrior Rain in the Face, said decades later that she rode ahead of the men, and that her courage shamed anyone who hesitated. Seeing a woman charge the line, he said, made the warriors around her fight twice as hard. By the end of that day, the 7th Cavalry under George Armstrong Custer had been wiped out. Among those credited with helping bring him down was a woman who, hours earlier, had only left camp to feed her family, and whose grief, within minutes, turned into one of the most consequential rides of the entire battle. 1864, Sand Creek. A 24-year-old Cheyenne woman named Mochi watches soldiers kill her mother in the Sand Creek Massacre and survives only by hiding beneath the bodies of the dead. What she does with that trauma over the next 11 years is the part almost nobody discusses. She does not withdraw from the fight. She rides beside her husband, Medicine Water, as a combatant, and the U.S. Army's own records document her presence in raids across the southern plains. In 1875, she is captured and sent to Fort Marion in Florida. Here is the detail that changes everything about how history should remember her. On her intake record, the Army did not write warrior's wife. It wrote combatant. With that single word, written by the very institution that fought her for over a decade, Mochi became the only Native American woman ever officially designated a prisoner of war by the United States government. She died at Fort Marion, still classified that way, an enemy the U.S. Army itself refused to describe as anything less. June 1876, the Battle of the Rosebud, Montana. A Cheyenne warrior is shot off his horse and lies wounded in the open, pinned by enemy fire with no one able to reach him. Then a woman spurs her horse into the line of fire, pulls her brother up behind her, and rides both of them out under the bullets. Her name is Buffalo Calf Road Woman, and to this day the Cheyenne remember that day as the day the girl saved her brother. 8 days later, she was at Little Bighorn, fighting beside her husband against the same 7th Cavalry. And this is the part that stayed out of the history books for over a century. In 2005, Cheyenne elders finally revealed publicly what oral tradition had preserved in private for generations. It was Buffalo Calf Road Woman's blow that knocked George Armstrong Custer off his horse in the final moments of the battle. She died in 1879. No statue, no film, almost no written record at all until her own people chose, more than 100 years later, to finally say her name out loud, meaning the woman most historians credit as central to Custer's defeat was, for over a century, missing from the story of her own battle. September 1858, the Battle of 4 Lakes, Washington Territory. The U.S. Army is advancing with long-range rifles against plateau tribes who are fighting with far less firepower. Yakama Chief Kamiakin is leading his warriors when a branch, torn loose by cannon fire, strikes him and knocks him from his horse in the open. His wife, Colsta, a respected healer and seer in her own right, refuses to stay at camp. She rides into the battle carrying a stone war club, reaches her husband under direct fire, drags him clear of the advancing soldiers, and treats his wounds herself with her own medicine. He survives the battle and lives on to lead his people for decades afterward. The Army's official reports recorded a victory. The Yakama people recorded something the reports left out entirely: the name of the woman who rode into cannon fire and brought her chief home alive. Without her, Kamiakin does not survive that afternoon, and an entire chapter of Yakama history is written differently. Victorio, one of the most feared Apache war leaders the United States Army ever faced, commanded hundreds of warriors. But when he needed someone he could trust completely, he turned to his sister. In front of the council, he called her "my right hand, a shield for our people." It was not a compliment, it was an accurate job description. For 30 years, Lozin fought the U.S. Army, first alongside Victorio, then alongside Geronimo in the final campaigns of Apache resistance. During one desperate escape, she crossed the Rio Grande under direct gunfire, personally guiding women and children to the far bank while covering their retreat. Military dispatches recorded her presence in combat multiple times across 3 decades. Not once in 30 years did any force manage to capture her in battle. She only surrendered in 1886 with the last Free Apache Band under Geronimo, and died 3 years later as a prisoner of tuberculosis in Mount Vernon Barracks, Alabama. No treaty carries her name. No film has ever told her story. The most complete warrior the Apache produced in the entire Old West era was erased from American memory with an efficiency no army ever managed to achieve against her in the field. Think about what that actually means. 30 years in the field against the most powerful military on the continent, and not one recorded capture. Scouts, cavalry patrols, entire campaigns organized specifically to hunt down Geronimo's band, and the woman coordinating their movements, their escapes, and their survival walked through all of it uncaught. She surrendered on her own people's terms, not the Army's. That is not a footnote. That is the single most successful resistance record of the entire Apache Wars, and it belongs to a woman most Americans have never once heard named. 15 women, 15 wars, negotiations, escapes, and acts of courage that change the outcome of the events around them. Not one of them has a Hollywood film. Most of them do not have a single statue. A few of them do not even have a confirmed photograph. What they have is this: oral histories carried for generations by their own people, Army records that couldn't help but document them even while trying to erase them, and occasionally one surviving photograph that most people scroll past without knowing what they're looking at. If this is the first time you're hearing even one of these names, that is exactly the point. History did not forget these women by accident. Records get filed, oral histories get dismissed as folklore, and the people who write the textbooks decide, generation after generation, which stories are worth repeating. None of that erasure happened because the evidence wasn't there. It happened because nobody with a platform chose to use it. Somewhere between a court transcript in colonial California, an Army intake ledger in Florida, and an oral tradition kept quiet by Cheyenne elders for over 100 years, 15 women did things that would have made them legends if they had been born on the other side of history's pen. They weren't. So the record sat waiting instead for whoever was willing to actually go looking. Comment which name on this list should have had a movie decades ago. And subscribe, because there are more names history tried to erase, and we are not done finding them.